When the lights went out at Silverstone Estates, the darkness did not arrive gently or with warning. It struck with surgical precision at exactly 7:38 p.m., silencing a neighborhood that had never known inconvenience. 80 luxury smart villas blinked once in collective disbelief before surrendering to the void. Thermostats went blank. Wine coolers sighed into uselessness. Bidets froze mid-cycle, and security systems died in obedient sequence. The blackout rolled through the gated enclave like a living thing, devouring comfort, certainty, and the illusion of control. For the first time since the community's creation, Silverstone Estates was reduced to silence, punctuated by confused voices and the glow of dying phone screens, clutched by residents who believed technology was a birthright. Panic bloomed almost instantly. Smart ovens shrieked their final warnings before going mute. Garage doors stalled halfway, trapping luxury vehicles in concrete limbo. Motorized gates groaned and stopped, leaving the fortress-like entrance embarrassingly open to the world beyond. Somewhere, someone cried out in genuine terror over an electric car that would no longer charge, as if the loss of mobility were a personal betrayal. In homes built to insulate their owners from discomfort, the air began to thicken, and sweat replaced entitlement. The community clubhouse, usually ablaze with lights and authority, fell just as dark, its grand presence reduced to a hollow silhouette. What made the blackout unbearable was not merely the absence of electricity, but the absence of preparedness. Silverstone Estates had been engineered to depend on systems it did not understand. Every convenience assumed uninterrupted power, and when that assumption failed, so did everything else. Residents wandered into streets that felt unfamiliar without their glow, murmuring questions that had no immediate answers. The exclusivity of the enclave offered no protection against physics, and wealth proved useless against overheating transformers and overloaded lines. Beyond the panic, there was a quieter contrast unfolding. While chaos rippled through the villas, one modest ranch cabin glowed with steady lantern light. Its generator purred evenly, indifferent to the hysteria outside the gates. The blackout exposed an uncomfortable truth. Resilience does not announce itself with luxury or status. It exists quietly, built on foresight and understanding rather than appearances. Silverstone Estates, for all its polished stone and curated elegance, had never invested in resilience. It had invested in image. As minutes stretched into hours, frustration hardened into fear. Refrigerators warmed, pools stagnated, and homes designed for automation became prisons of heat and helplessness. The blackout stripped away the veneer of sophistication and revealed a community utterly dependent on forces it dismissed as someone else's responsibility. What had once been marketed as a flawless living experience became a cautionary tableau of modern fragility. When the lights finally returned, they did not simply restore illumination, they restored hierarchy, memory, and consequence. The blackout lingered long after the power surged back, etched into the collective psyche of Silverstone Estates as the moment comfort failed, authority faltered, and the truth about where real power lived could no longer be ignored. The HOA president who tried to control the grid believed authority was something that could be asserted through titles, letters, and penalties, never realizing that real power obeys laws far older and far less forgiving than any homeowners association bylaws. To her, the neighborhood was not a collection of residents, but a system to be managed, corrected, and disciplined. Every rule existed to reinforce her sense of order, and every challenge to that order felt personal. When she set her attention on the electrical infrastructure, she was not protecting the community, she was defending her illusion of dominance. She spoke of the grid as though it were a personal possession, a thing she could command by sheer force of will. In her mind, authority over appearances extended naturally into authority over function. If something existed within the boundaries of the neighborhood, she assumed it fell under her jurisdiction. Cables buried beneath soil, easements signed decades earlier, and technical realities beyond her comprehension were treated as inconveniences rather than facts. The complexity of electrical systems was reduced to suspicion and fear, framed in dramatic language meant to sound informed, but crafted to intimidate. Her approach relied on paper power. Cease and desist notices appeared bearing official-looking headers and excessive formatting, designed to impress rather than inform. Violations were invented with confidence, citing aesthetic disruption, imagined hazards, and vague threats to community harmony. Each letter carried fines that escalated daily, not because they were justified, but because punishment itself was the point. She believed that repetition and authority could bend reality, that systems built by engineers and governed by physics would yield to her directives if stated firmly enough. When explanations were offered, they were dismissed. Technical clarity threatened her position because understanding would require humility. Instead, she surrounded herself with affirmations and hired voices that mirrored her fears, mistaking performance for expertise. The grid became a symbol rather than a system, something to be feared and controlled rather than respected and maintained. By positioning herself as the guardian of community safety, she justified actions that were reckless, invasive, and ultimately destructive. Her greatest mistake was assuming compliance equaled competence. Ordering a disconnection felt like victory, a public demonstration that her authority extended even into the invisible arteries of power. She celebrated the act as enforcement, never considering that removing a stabilizing force could unravel everything she claimed to protect. The grid did not resist her out of spite, it failed because it was stripped of balance. Transformers overheated, loads surged, and the carefully curated neighborhood collapsed into darkness. In the aftermath, her control evaporated. The same residents who once applauded strict enforcement now demanded answers, and the language of authority rang hollow against burnt circuitry and ruined appliances. The HOA president who tried to control the grid learned too late that power cannot be commanded by ignorance. True authority lies in understanding limits, respecting expertise, and knowing when control is an illusion. Her reign ended not with a vote or a speech, but with silence, darkness, and the unmistakable hum of consequences she could no longer deny. How one engineer became the community's only power source is not a story of ambition or conquest, but of quiet preparation meeting spectacular misjudgment. Long before the neighborhood understood its vulnerability, he had already accepted it. Years spent working with circuits, load calculations, and failure scenarios had taught him a simple truth. Systems always fail eventually, and the only question is whether someone planned for that moment. While others trusted convenience and outsourced responsibility, he invested in independence, not out of defiance, but out of habit. His property sat at a critical junction, a fact most people ignored because it was buried underground and written in documents no one bothered to read. Power lines crossed his land by easement, carrying energy to dozens of homes that never considered where it came from or how fragile the arrangement truly was. For decades, the setup functioned smoothly, not because it was robust, but because nothing disturbed the balance. When the community aged and demand grew, that balance became increasingly delicate. He saw the warning signs in voltage dips and fluctuating loads long before anyone else noticed discomfort. Rather than complain, he acted. Solar arrays rose quietly on his barn roof, angled toward efficiency rather than attention. Batteries filled a shed, capable of absorbing excess energy and releasing it with precision. A generator stood ready, not as a statement, but as a contingency. His system did more than supply his own needs. It smoothed and stabilized the flow of electricity passing through his land, compensating for infrastructure neglect upstream. Unbeknownst to most residents, their uninterrupted luxury was already leaning on his foresight. When pressure came, it arrived in the form of misunderstanding and ego. The idea that one individual could play such a vital role offended those accustomed to authority without expertise. His explanations were met with suspicion, as though knowledge itself were an act of rebellion. When he was cut off, the community believed it had asserted control. In reality, it had severed its own lifeline. The engineer did not panic or retaliate. He simply allowed the system to behave as systems always do when destabilized. The failure was swift and total. Heat, demand, and imbalance converged, and the grid collapsed exactly as predicted. In that moment, the engineer became something the community had never imagined it would need, the only source capable of restoring order. Phones rang, voices softened, and titles lost their weight. What remained was necessity. His independence transformed into indispensability, not because he sought leverage, but because he had built something that worked. When electricity returned, it did so on new terms. Agreements replaced assumptions, respect replaced posturing, and the community learned that resilience cannot be delegated without consequence. One engineer became the power source not by seizing control, but by understanding responsibility. In the end, electricity flowed again, but so did a new awareness. Survival favors those who prepare quietly while others argue loudly. From blackout chaos to public apology, the transformation of the community unfolded as swiftly as it was humiliating. What began as a sudden loss of electricity spiraled into a complete collapse of order, exposing how thin the veneer of control truly was. In the darkness, authority evaporated. Titles meant nothing when gates stood open, alarms were silent, and luxury homes trapped their owners in stifling heat. The panic that followed was not dignified or restrained. It was raw, confused, and deeply uncomfortable for people who had long equated rules with security. As hours passed, frustration replaced shock. Residents demanded explanations, then solutions, and finally accountability. Phones rang unanswered, emails piled up, and the once confident leadership found itself paralyzed. The very individuals who had enforced penalties with unwavering confidence now struggled to provide even basic reassurance. Every failed appliance and overheated room became a silent accusation. The blackout had turned the community into a living audit of neglected infrastructure and misplaced priorities. The return of light did not restore order instantly. Instead, it illuminated consequences. Repairs came with staggering costs, and assessments revealed the full scope of the damage. Residents learned that the outage was not an unavoidable accident, but the result of deliberate decisions made without understanding. The realization spread unevenly at first, whispered in driveways and hallways, before solidifying into collective resentment. Authority that once went unquestioned was now scrutinized, dissected, and openly challenged. Amid this reckoning stood the figure they had dismissed, the person whose warnings were ignored, whose expertise was treated as inconvenience, had been proven right in the most public way possible. The power imbalance shifted decisively. Conversations that once relied on threats now leaned heavily on appeals. The language of enforcement gave way to the language of reconciliation, not out of humility, but out of necessity. The community needed what only one individual could provide. The public apology was not theatrical, but it was unmistakable. Spoken before an audience that understood its significance, it marked the collapse of false confidence. Words that once commanded obedience now trembled with restraint. Each sentence acknowledged misjudgment, though carefully phrased to soften its sting. Yet no amount of scripting could erase the reality everyone had witnessed. The apology was less about contrition and more about survival, a concession to reality rather than a moral awakening. In that moment, the community crossed a threshold. The blackout had stripped away illusions, and the apology cemented a new understanding of power. Control, they learned, cannot be manufactured through rules alone. it must be grounded in knowledge, respect, and responsibility. From chaos to apology, the journey was costly, uncomfortable, and irreversible. The lights came back on, but the memory of darkness ensured that nothing would ever function quite the same again. The fall of an HOA tyrant and the price of arrogance unfolded not with drama designed for sympathy, but with the quiet inevitability of consequence. For years, authority had been exercised through intimidation rather than understanding, with rules enforced not for harmony but for control. Power was measured in fines issued, letters sent, and compliance extracted. This system thrived only as long as it was never challenged by reality. When that challenge finally arrived, it exposed how fragile such dominance truly was. Arrogance thrives on certainty, and the tyrant's greatest flaw was the belief that position alone conferred wisdom. Expertise was dismissed as defiance, warnings were reinterpreted as threats, and cooperation was viewed as weakness. Decisions were made to assert superiority rather than to solve problems, and every action reinforced the illusion that authority could override expertise. In this environment, dissent was punished swiftly, while loyalty was rewarded with favor and silence. The collapse came when that arrogance collided with forces beyond rhetoric and regulation. Infrastructure does not respond to posturing, and electricity does not negotiate. The moment control was asserted without comprehension, the system failed spectacularly. Darkness swept through the community, taking with it the illusion of competence that had been carefully maintained. Residents who once applauded strict governance suddenly found themselves demanding accountability from the very figure they had empowered. What followed was not immediate remorse, but resistance. Arrogance rarely yields gracefully. Explanations were deflected, responsibility diluted, and blame subtly redirected. Yet evidence has a way of eroding denial. Repair estimates, contractual revelations, and professional assessments piled up, each document another crack in the facade. The cost was no longer abstract, it was measurable in destroyed appliances, inflated utility rates, and public embarrassment. The true fall came not in private realization, but in public reckoning. Apologies were required, not requested. Admissions of error were documented, not implied. Authority that once operated unchecked was now constrained by oversight, agreements, and written acknowledgement of past mistakes. The tyrant who once dictated terms now complied with them, each signature a reminder that arrogance carries a ledger, and it always comes due. The price extended beyond money. Reputation suffered irreparable damage, and the confidence that once fueled dominance evaporated under scrutiny. Former supporters distanced themselves, eager to escape association with failure. Leadership, once maintained through fear, dissolved when fear changed direction. The fall was complete not because power was taken away, but because it was revealed to have never truly existed. In the end, the community learned an enduring lesson. Authority without humility is temporary. Control without understanding is dangerous. The fall of the HOA tyrant was not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of arrogance unchecked. The price was steep, the lesson unforgettable, and the silence left behind spoke louder than any rule ever enforced.